I have to warn you, the deep dive today is going to get a little weird.
Just a little.
Okay, fine. Maybe a lot.
Yeah.
We are stepping way off the solid ground of, how to enter data in a spreadsheet.
And wading straight into the deep end.
The very deep end of what is reality actually made of.
Yeah.
We're talking about a stack of sources that connects ancient Greek philosophy to modern neurology, quantum mechanics, and this is the part that really got me. Why you might not actually be a fully formed adult until you're 32.
It is a really eclectic mix. What I love about this particular synthesis, though, is that it takes these massive names, Freud, Sartre, Kant, Parmenides.
Yeah, names that usually make you think of a boring lecture hall.
Exactly. And it treats them like they're all investigators working on the same case.
That's the vibe I got, too. It feels like a detective story.
Yeah.
And the mystery is the human mind. So the mission for this deep dive is to try and understand the collective unconscious, but not in some, vague mystical sense.
Yeah.
We're looking at the argument that it's a literal, physical, infinite information network.
Right. The source is arguing this isn't just a metaphor, it's an actual infrastructure. It influences your dreams, your creativity. I mean, it basically dictates how you define you.
Yeah.
So yeah, we need to peel back the layers of this argument.
Okay, let's do it. Let's jump into what the source calls the Great Connection. The author basically lines up three huge historical concepts and says, look, these are all the same thing. We start in ancient Greece with Parmenides.
Parmenides is the starting point, yeah. He's famous for the concept of monism.
Right, monism.
It's the philosophical argument that existence is a single, uncreated, infinite force. There are no separate parts. Everything is just the one.
You'd call it God in the theological context, I guess.
Or the unified field in physics.
Yeah.
But the core idea is just unity.
Okay, so we have the one. Then the source moves on to Plato.
And Plato introduces the world of ideas. His argument was that the physical world we see, chairs, tables, trees, they're all just shadows.
Imperfect copies.
Exactly. Imperfect copies. The real reality exists in this higher realm of perfect forms or ideas. So the idea of a circle is perfect. But any circle you draw on paper is just a flawed copy.
It's like the source code versus the user interface on your computer.
That is a perfect analogy.
We only see the interface, but the reality is the code underneath.
Precisely. And then, to round out the trifecta, you have Immanuel Kant.
In the 18th century.
Right, with the noumena, or the thing in itself. Kant argued that human beings can never actually know the true essence of an object. We only know how our senses perceive it. We get the sensory data, but the thing in itself is always hidden from us.
So we've got Parmenides' one force, Plato's hidden forms, and Kant's unknowable thing. And the source is claiming these aren't three separate theories.
Correct. The core argument here is that these philosophers were all trying to describe the same underlying structure. They lack the vocabulary that Carl Jung later provided. They were all describing the collective unconscious.
Okay, so Jung put a psychological name to a philosophical idea.
He grounded it. He said, this hidden world isn't just out there in the ether. It is the shared software running in all of our minds.
But then the source takes this, hard left turn from psychology straight into physics. They describe this collective unconscious as an infinite information network. And they start talking about waves.
This is where it gets into some quantum speculation. The source suggests that if you look at quantum mechanics, reality at its most basic level is wave-based.
Right. Particles exist as probabilities until they're observed.
Exactly, as waves. So the argument is that the collective unconscious is effectively a wave-based information network that, permeates the entire universe.
And they don't limit this to just human brains.
No, and this is where some listeners might feel a bit of vertigo. The source explicitly speculates that everything carries information, water, the sun.
Wait, hold on. Let's clarify that. Are they saying the sun is conscious like a person?
Not like a personality, but more that it's a node in this massive information web. If the universe is a network of waves, then the sun and the water are part of the hardware just as much as your brain is.
Okay, so if we accept this premise for a minute, this universal Wi-Fi network of information that we're all swimming in, how do we actually access it? I don't feel like I'm downloading files from the sun.
You are, though. You just call it intuition.
Or dreaming.
Or dreaming. The source argues that when we sleep or when we enter these deep creative states, we are essentially logging onto the network. And the main way the network communicates is through synchronicity.
This is the part of the research that felt the most tangible to me. The author shares a personal story about dreaming of these futuristic skyscrapers.
Yeah.
Very specific designs, really weird angles, and then seeing those exact buildings appear in the real world years later.
It raises that classic Jungian question, was that a premonition? Or if you stick with the network theory, was the author just tapping into the same world of ideas?
The same creative blueprint that the architects were using.
Right. It suggests ideas aren't really generated inside our heads, they're caught, more like a radio signal.
And that signal is almost never a literal blueprint.
It's usually a symbol. The source breaks down how the unconscious uses a very specific visual language.
The snake example was a really good practical tip.
It's so specific. The source analyzes the symbolism of snakes in dreams. A black snake wrapping around you isn't a threat.
Right. It signifies safety, protection.
A grounding force.
Yeah.
But a yellow snake, that represents danger.
So it's color-coded. Black is safe, yellow is caution.
Essentially. But what I found even more compelling was how the source explains the evolution of these symbols. Because, we aren't living in the 12th century anymore.
Our environment has changed.
So the interface of the unconscious has to update itself.
Which brings us to the dragon myth. I love this analogy. It just makes so much sense of the modern world.
It really does. Think about the classic myth. You've got the dragon, which is the monster or the threat.
The princess, who's the victim or the prize.
And the knight, the savior. That's the base code of the story. But in the 20th century, we didn't have dragons running around, so the unconscious updated the imagery.
The dragon became the locomotive, the train.
Exactly. A massive, steam-breathing iron beast that cannot be stopped.
And the princess.
She became the woman tied to the railroad tracks, and the knight is the hero racing to untie her before the train comes.
The props change, but the play is exactly the same.
The psychological architecture is identical. It's still a story about an overwhelming, inhuman force and the desperate need for human intervention. The collective unconscious just updates the skin of the myth so it still resonates with us.
So we're receiving these updated myths. We're the audience. But then the source brings in Viktor Frankl, who just flips that whole dynamic on its head.
Frankl is crucial here. He was a psychiatrist, a Holocaust survivor, famous for man's search for meaning. But the source highlights a lesser-known part of his thinking. The idea that we can actually create archetypes. We're not just read-only users. We have right access.
How does that even work? I can't just sit here and decide, I am now the coffee archetype.
Right. It's not an intellectual decision. The source is very careful about this. You can't just brand yourself into an archetype. For a new one to be created, it takes a massive, a seismic emotional impact. It has to be something that restructures your psyche from the bottom up.
Frankl identified with a forest archetype, right?
Yes. And for him, that wasn't just, a preference for nature. It was a structural part of his identity, likely forged through his intense life experiences. It implies that if we experience life deeply enough, we can upload our own avatars into the collective network.
That sounds empowering, but also exhausting.
Yeah.
It implies we have to do some serious renovation on our own minds.
Yeah.
Which I guess leads us to the ego.
The ego, the thing everyone in spirituality is trying to kill.
The source talks about ego death. And usually when you hear that, it sounds terrifying, like you're going to just dissolve into nothing.
But in this context, the source frames it as a necessary step for individuation. That's Jung's term for becoming your true whole self.
Right.
You can't become who you really are if you're clinging so tightly to this rigid mask you built to survive your childhood. You have to let that structure collapse a bit.
And part of that collapse is meeting your shadow.
The shadow. Yeah, it contains all the parts of yourself you don't want to admit exist. The aggression, the jealousy, the weird desire.
The stuff you push down.
And the source argues we have to integrate it, not to become bad people, but because that's where all the energy is. If you spend all your energy holding the door shut on your shadow, you have no energy left to create anything.
Speaking of growing up and integrating things, there was a statistic in the neurology section of the source that I think is going to validate a lot of people listening.
Oh, I know which one you're talking about.
We tend to think, okay, you're 18, you're an adult, maybe 21 at the latest.
But the source cites research suggesting adolescence doesn't neurologically end until age 32.
32. That is a full decade later than we usually assume.
It explains a lot, doesn't it? The brain is still pruning synapses, organizing neural pathways, stabilizing its executive function well into the third decade of life. The source even mentions looking back at age 34 or 35 and realizing that in their mid-20s, they were still running on teenage hardware, basically.
So if you're 27 and you feel like you're just faking adulthood, It's because, biologically, you kind of are.
You're still in the oven. Your brain is still building the final version of you.
Now, while Jung is looking inward at all this development, the source contrasts him with Jean-Paul Sartre, and Sartre looks outward.
Sartre has a very different, almost colder take on the ego. He argues the ego belongs to the world.
What does that distinction even mean?
Well, think about how you define yourself. Sartre argues that the ego is formed by a mechanism of exclusion. It's built by what you reject.
The music example in the text made this really clear.
It was perfect. Let's say you identify as a rock fan. Sartre would say, you aren't defining yourself by your love of rock. You are defining yourself by your rejection of folk music or pop or country.
So, I am me because I am not that.
Exactly. The things you exclude are the bricks that build the wall of your personality. It's a mechanism of rejection. We carve our identity out of the void of what we dislike.
That is a heavy thought. It implies our personality is basically a fortress built out of our own prejudices.
It creates a structure. And that structure is what we call the ego. But as we said, that structure is fragile. It can be broken down and rebuilt.
We can't do a deep dive on the unconscious without bringing in the grandfather of the field, Sigmund Freud. But the source makes an interesting point here. Freud was not a mystic. He was a materialist.
Oh, absolutely. He wanted to be a scientist. He wanted psychology to be as rigorous as neurology. But the source points out that Freud kept bumping into things that biology just couldn't explain. He couldn't quite close the door on the metaphysical.
And nothing illustrates that better than Freud's pelican.
I have to share this because it is just such a bizarre image.
It is. The source details a specific dream Freud had. He saw his mother, but she wasn't quite human. She was a hybrid creature.
Half human, half pelican.
Half human, half pelican.
I
Which
think.
sounds like a nightmare you'd discuss with a therapist.
But Freud was the therapist.
And he didn't understand it at the time. It was too strange for his logical framework. But the source points out that in ancient mythology, the pelican is a symbol of self-sacrifice. It was believed the pelican would wound its own breast to feed its young with its blood.
So the unconscious was serving up a perfect archetype of the sacrificial mother, even though Freud the scientist couldn't parse it logically.
Exactly. It shows that gap between logic and intuition. Logic, the tool of the ego, looked at the dream and just saw nonsense. But intuition, the connection to the network, it understood the symbol instantly.
This leads to the final philosophical point the source makes about intuition. They bring up the Islamic thinker Imam Ghazali. This is such a great addition to the stack because usually in Western philosophy, we credit Henri Bergson with championing intuition. But centuries earlier, Ghazali was arguing that intuition is actually the primary source of knowledge.
He ranked it above logic.
He did. He argued that logic is a step-by-step process. It's like reading a manual to understand a machine. But intuition, that's direct knowledge. That is plugging directly into the mainframe. He believed that the knowing you get from intuition is more reliable, more fundamental than anything you can derive through philosophy.
It's validating for anyone who's ever had a gut feeling that turned out to be right, even when all the data said otherwise.
It suggests that gut feeling isn't a guess, it's a download.
So let's try to zoom out and look at the whole picture we've painted here, because we have covered a lot of ground. We started with the idea that the self is sort of an illusion, that we're all part of a monistic, quantum, wave-based network.
Right, and we saw that this network speaks to us in symbols. It even updates its interface from dragons to trains so we can still get the message.
We learned from Frankl that we aren't just passive observers. If we experience life deeply enough, we can create our own archetypes. We can write back to the system.
We found out our brains are still under construction until we're 32, which gives us all a bit of grace for our 20s. And we learned from Sartre that our ego is built by what we reject just as much as what we accept.
And finally, we saw Freud dreaming of pelicans, reminding us that no matter how much science we apply, the unconscious is always going to be a little bit weirder than we expect.
It's a lot to synthesize, but the key takeaway for me is that this hidden web isn't just a dusty old theory. It frames our internal world as real architecture. Your dreams, your intuition, your personality, these aren't just smoke. They're as real as the building you are sitting in right now.
It really reframes how you move through the world. You're not just an isolated individual. You're a node in a massive system.
And that leads me to a question I've been thinking about since we discussed the train dragon. We talked about how myths update themselves. The dragon became the train because the train was the dominant, overwhelming force of that era.
Right.
Well, we are currently living through a technological shift that makes the steam engine look like a child's toy. AI, the internet, virtual reality, We are rewiring the entire world. So if Frankl is right, and we have the power to create new archetypes.
What are we building right now?
Exactly. What is the train dragon of the 21st century? In 100 years, when people analyze the dreams of the 2020s, what monsters or gods will they find? Are we building a digital sage? An infinite labyrinth? Or something we don't even have a name for yet?
We might be unknowingly breathing life into new myths right now, just by how we interact with our screens every day.
We almost certainly are.
That is something to chew on. The next time you have a weird dream, maybe don't just brush it off. You might be seeing the new code being written. Thanks for exploring the hidden web with us today.
See you on the next deep dive.